two, one, and
hello, everybody.
All right, looks like we are live. Thank you, Justin. And welcome everyone to the panel fundraiser titled The Importance of Political Science Education and Student Governments, hosted by the International Association for Political Science Students, IAPSS, the only democratic student government representing political science students at the global level recognized by the United Nations. My name is Alexis Riba, and I'm the chair of the United States and Canada region at IAPSS. And with me, I have the president of IAPSS, Justin Patrick, the director for international corporations and diplomacy, Rory Monshine, and Professor Dr. Froese, who is a professor at Burman University in Alberta, Canada, who teaches political science courses. And I will let Rory talk about the context of the day, of today's day of service in the United States, and why it's important for Americans and why we're hosting an event on this day.
Sure, thank you so much, Alexi. My name is Rory Monshine. I'm the Director of Civic Engagement and Strategic Diplomacy at the International Association for Political Science Students. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to today's event. As you know, today is Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service. And the significance of that is that we need to think about ways that we can think globally and act locally and empower people in our communities to take action to make the world a more equitable place. And to that effect, we're going to be empowering you to think about how you guys can contribute to empowering people in your community and promote global student governance around the world so that way we can all cooperate with one another. So today is a very significant day, and we're so excited to have you here with us to have this interactive discussion with you all. Alexi, over to you to explain the format. You're on mute.
Thank you, Rory. So we'll have two main panelists. I will be just asking questions and talking about the context of our questions, but our two main panelists are Dr. Froese and Dr. Mark Froese, and the president of IAPSS, Justin Patrick. And today we talk about two main things: is why political science education is vital in modern world, why is it relevant, and Dr. Froese will be our primary expert on this, and Justin Patrick will be primarily talking about student governments. However, both of them will be sharing opinions and insights on what they think about each other's subjects. So, in the context of maybe my studies, as I've been studying closely related discipline, closely related to political science, called international studies, and I've been asking people have been asking me, what is it about and what do you do with it? What is the political science? And as we're seeing the world getting more complex and with greater access to information, and perhaps not it's not always easy to distinguish what information is true or not. Perhaps political science is more important than ever. And the significance of having politically educated citizens in the country definitely cannot be underestimated with the current threats of populism around the world. So our first question, and perhaps a bit broad question, but we'll see where it takes us from here. What is the value of political science education as a major, so to pursue it as a main discipline, and as a subject for people outside of this discipline? Dr. Froese, what's your take on that? Dr. Froese, you're muted.
I'm so used to being the host of the meeting. I've been teaching all day today that I forget to completely unmute myself here. I'm used to being the only person who's unmuted. Okay, so I would say even 10 years ago, this question of sort of why is political science education relevant wouldn't have even been asked. It would have been an assumption that poli-sci is one of those great nuts and bolts, hard social sciences that has this kind of privileged position where it is not quite economics, but it certainly is not slumming it through the kind of, you know, pedestrian thoroughfares of history and sociology, right? That we are the academics who study power, organization, governance, and government. And as a result, what we're doing is always practical and relevant. But then, of course, this changed, partly because, I mean, for a bunch of reasons. I would say one of the biggest reasons being demographic shifts, especially in the US, have meant that universities are having a hard time filling up majors. And as a result, lots of things are on the chopping block, not business, not economics, but definitely everything poli-sci on down through sociology, history, any of the studies, international studies, American studies, Canadian studies, etc. All that stuff is up for renegotiation. And as luck would have it, we also have that happening at a time when we see unprecedented levels of polarization that make the study of politics, broadly speaking, more important than ever. So I think it's really important that you guys, as poli-sci students, are able to go out there and say, listen, understanding democracy is really important. A basic civics education is absolutely essential. I mean, I think most of you watching the news on a daily basis understand seeing, you know, for example, this mob at the US Capitol who fundamentally doesn't understand modern history or the nature of deliberative democracy. At the same time, we have this, you know, belief that what we do in political science is in some ways just practical. It's just a thing that ought not to be thought about too closely. So I think it's very important that we do think about that. I also think it's important that you as political science majors, however, do a little more, go above and beyond to show the relevance of political science. And that doesn't mean just doing a good job in, you know, your American politics senior seminar paper or capstone project. I mean, you're going to have to show the relevance of what you do by getting other hard skills and soft skills. So I would encourage all of you to not only do a political science degree, a great way to go to law school or do a master's degree in public policy or, you know, God forbid, a PhD, but gain the skills that make what you do look and feel more relevant, not only to potential employers, but also to grad schools. So get another language, travel, see the world, experience politics outside of the North American bubble, and use that experience to develop yourself as a person and as a student. I mean, I can't tell you how important it is to just go different places and make yourself useful. Develop the skills to meet other people, to live other places, to learn those languages. So important. I have my students, not only do they do all the basics, the macroeconomics, the microeconomics, stats, research methods, all that kind of jazz, they also have to learn a language and they have to travel. And I would say even more important now, it'll be even more important now that we know that there are global dimensions to public policy beyond trade, finance, and investment, right? Social policy, health policy, all that stuff has important dimensions. And I think it's more important than ever that poli-sci students show themselves to be internationally oriented.
Thank you, Dr. Froese. This was the perspective of a professor, why political science is important, but also why additional soft skills are important in addition to your poli-sci degree. Let's switch over to a student perspective. I will ask Justin, who has completed a bachelor degree and a master's degree in political science and is leading IAPSS as a president, which is by the way, the organization is entirely led by students and has multiple professional opportunities for political science students, including travel, conferences, research committees, and more. And it's entirely run by students and funded by students. Thus, just reminding you that our event is also a fundraiser. But back to Justin. Justin, what do you think you gained the most from your degrees studying political science at university?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of it's the potential, right? So I guess to maybe build on the previous point as well, it's generally not just the knowledge about politics, but ideally we'd want information about how to practice politics, right? Politics as an art in addition to politics as a science. So I think the issue perhaps with curricula in the US, Canada, other areas around the world as well, is that I think educators, other education stakeholders have to meet students halfway. So as an example, the American Political Science Association had a conference in summer 2019 about kind of how to restructure the undergraduate political science major. And at this conference, it was, unfortunate that most of the perspectives were educator focused. They're always like saying that, oh, the students aren't enrolling as much as before. How do we get them to enroll? But there wasn't a lot of focus on, are the students who enroll going to get sustainable jobs and careers after their graduation? So it's also important to think about the future, right? The future of these students, because it's going to be their lives. So, and obviously there's lots of political research that needs to be done. I think that in terms of the positivist empirical research, there's so many levels of government that need to be explored, whether it's municipal governments or even student governments like IAPSS, where if with the student government case, there's, at least tens or hundreds of thousands of student governments around the world, and they all have elections, some of them every year. And that data could be tracked, it could be measured, and it could be studied to see how can we make things better in the future. And in addition, I think there's an extracurricular aspect to that, because political science students have a very important role to play on the campus, because as many campuses have student governments, it's important for those to have good, strong democracies. And because in some cases, student government is a student's first interaction with politics. So if that interaction is seen as kind of not having any consequential policy outcomes, or if it's corrupt or ineffective, then it might turn off students' perspectives toward politics for the rest of their lives in some cases. So as political science students, I think we play a crucial role in trying to foster this, and IAPSS is doing this on the world stage by getting other student governments together for the other subjects like medical studies and physics and stuff, to try to make a global student government for all the students of all the subjects. But yeah, I think we do all the other education stakeholders need to kind of help foster this student perspective and to make sure that the various, politics as a science, politics as an art, job security are all properly represented, right? Because if students can practice politics, then it will lead to a better society afterwards, and help limit and help reduce the possibility of populism resurfacing.
Justin, you've touched on many important things and interesting phenomena around the world. One thing I wanted to talk maybe deeper about is the student government. Here at IAPSS, we have democracy. Our positions are elected. You have been elected by political science students. I was elected as a regional chair for political science students. What are the problems facing students in various students unions with regards to democracy and maybe them executing their ideas? What are the current challenges in student unions, particularly maybe in North America?
Yeah, so as it's mostly focused on the United States, this event, I'll talk about the US case in particular, but in general, around the world, student government has faced significant challenges in the 21st century, and in a number of countries and continents is in retrenchment. So an example of this is the United States. So in the 1940s, the United States, student associations, kind of predecessor organizations, were founded. And for much of the 20th century, there was a national student government in the US. So every student who was attending a post-secondary institution could hypothetically have a vote in this that could make an impact on policies that students put forward at the national level. However, due to a number of laws that were passed that limited the ability of student governments to collect fees and some other kind of issues, lack of engagement, lack of funding, the United States Student Association actually collapsed a few years ago. So you can find them on Google, but if you try to call their number, it doesn't go there anymore, and their office is gone. So we actually had a meeting with one of their last vice presidents, and they explained to us that, yeah, they're trying to rebuild it, but right now, essentially, US students don't really have a united voice, and that's given the current political situation in the United States, that's a serious issue, right? Our student view is going to be protected, especially when we face issues like the rampant privatization of education, the issues facing education accessibility, and because the problem is that students now aren't really at the table. So as IAPSS, we're international, we're trying to go in and kind of re-foster this engagement on various campuses, but in many cases, the engagement just isn't there. We've sent communications out to various campuses over the past year and a half, and for some reason, like every other continent, the students generally get involved, but in the US in particular, it's very difficult. And it's almost like the retrenchment of student government has led to the erosion of I guess that kind of that political hope, right? That things can get done. So now it's a very, very serious situation indeed. And since the USSA was very integral to international student politics, now students in the US aren't represented at the international level very much either. There are the subject-based ones like IAPSS, but mainly things are very Eurocentric. And the thing with uh, student issues in Europe is that many of those countries have free tuition. So perhaps they don't need to lobby for things like lowering tuition fees or making education free quite as much as students in the US might, or might have different concerns. And like, for example, when IAPSS goes to meetings with UNESCO, it's there's not a lot of, like, the US students, unfortunately, largely aren't there. It's almost like the isolationism of the Trump era has sort of infected the student governments as well, unfortunately.
That is a pretty no, I don't want to say depressing in this panel. Just want to be more optimistic, but overall a sad state of affairs. Dr. Proles, what was it like, during your student years when you were students, your experience with student associations, and do you think there is a way out of this apathy and disengagement of students with student governments?
So, when I was an undergrad, I never joined student government. I knew that the students who did, I knew some of them, but I never did it myself. In fact, I thought it was dumb. I thought student government is useless. It's where students play at government to practice because one day they want to be politicians or some such thing. Of course, this is completely false, right? I had a very myopic view. I was 19 years old and I was stupid. I would say to my 19-year-old self, get involved. And I began to see that when I was in grad school. I would say, by and large in Canada, there is more activity in student government, I think, than in the US. And I would say that perhaps the reason for that, if I could point to one factor, I would probably say the higher rate of university labor unionization. So most graduate students belong to a union, for example. They pay union dues. They make a union salary when they work as TAs and that kind of thing. And I think this facilitates more of an idea of cohesive cooperation in politics. on Canadian campuses. That being said, when I was in my undergrad at the University of Toronto, student government was not prominent. It was not out front and center. It was the kind of thing you would seek out and do if you wanted to. I shouldn't say that, not in every case, not in every case. I think it did have moments of prominence, especially around the anti-globalization movement of the early 2000s. So I don't want to overplay that statement at all. That being said, I think if we're looking for a way out of this impasse today, especially in the US, it's going to come from students like you who say organization is better than apathy in every single case. We're seeing what apathy gets you. It gets you people organizing stupid things on the internet, right? Organization in person or Zoom, obviously during the pandemic, of getting together and saying, let's find a way to work together to make this better. You can never go wrong doing that. Always, always better than simple consumption and apathy. And I think we've been sliding towards that method of what's in it for me? What's the transaction? What do I get out of this? And I think we have to start thinking more in terms of what do we all get out of coming together.
You have witnessed perhaps the rise of globalization. Like probably I've seen this interesting point about, I think on Twitter, that maybe the beginning of intense globalization period was the opening of McDonald's in Moscow, at the time still Soviet Union, and the end date of globalization, intense globalization, is Brexit. You know, living through this and living through this period, and now living through COVID and thinking about our life in post-COVID world, maybe particularly about travel, any international things, maybe the global student governments or anything from our previous lives, pre-COVID life, but also in the context of deglobalization. How do you see our future as international relations students, as political science students?
I think you should take deglobalization seriously as a political phenomenon. And I think there's a lot of good research that shows we are seeing, even before the pandemic, ebbs in trade and interdependence, absolutely. That being said, I think you as political science students have to think more globally than ever. I think do not fall down the rabbit hole of thinking deglobalization means pulling back just to the local. You should be locally and globally oriented in everything you do, not only because the local is so important for political change, but also because the global gives you that perspective that allows you to bring new ideas into that change. I'm reminded of, for example, the internationals of the 1920s and 30s, the socialists and later the Soviet internationals, in which the left looked hard at ways to organize itself far beyond the nation state. And I think I'm not advocating that you guys ought to go off and create communes or, you know, dictatorship of the proletariat, but I am suggesting there is something to be said about international organization, about working together beyond the state, and about orienting yourself beyond your parochial level and into what's happening in other parts of the world. Why is it happening, and how is it connected to what's happening with you at home?
Right now we have, you know, if this pandemic would have happened sometime before, probably been even way worse without the technology we have, but now we're able to connect wherever we are, which is great and gives perhaps student governments more opportunities to cooperate and build big things, as opposed to students from 20, 30 years ago who didn't have that technology. Justin, why do you see a potential in a global student government, and what can it provide for students from around the world?
Yeah, so there are a few main areas. The first is advocacy, right? If more students work together, then there's a better chance of policies being reformed that are in students' interests. So on many campuses, even national student governments and continental ones that exist, they're often at a large disadvantage in comparison to whether the university administration, whether it's a state government that they're up against, right? They don't have enough resources to compete with that. And However, if say there was a campus and there was a serious issue facing students on that campus, but students in a variety of other countries came together to help pick that battle, to help those students on that campus overturn that, it would have a greater chance of meeting the non-student actors within the education system on a more equal footing. And there would be a better chance in terms of resources to sort of outlast their adversaries in terms of the political campaigns and stuff like that. The other possibility is extracurricular development and just student services development. A number of student governments organize extracurricular activities, and if those extracurricular activities cooperate with each other, then it would increase the potential to for collaboration and could increase the quality as well. As for example, if there's say debate clubs, right? And say if debate clubs in 20 countries all pool their resources together to have larger scale events, it could lead to perhaps more opportunities, more niche topics, and maybe an enriched extracurricular experience. On the student services side, a number of student governments, maybe not so much in the US, but in Canada and Europe have things like subsidized health insurance, or in some cases even subsidized transit passes, right? So if you have larger groups of students who are pooling their resources together, they could enroll in bulk versions of these services, and which could perhaps lower the cost per student even further, or offer these services to students who don't have access to them. And it could also explore the opportunity for sharing best practices to increase the capabilities of student governments as organizations to develop additional business models, because a number of them run businesses, and to make sure that the knowledge is retained. Because one of the major issues is that since student populations are very transient, they're always being renewed, students graduate, they enroll, it's very important to make sure that the knowledge stays within the organization, because every 4 years, essentially, an entire student population is completely replaced in many institutions. So it's very important to have these larger structures to cooperate, to gather knowledge. Perhaps in case a student government collapses, the knowledge can still be retained by the larger overarching organization. And when it rebuilds itself, the knowledge can be shared again, and it can kind of start a bit better off than if it was starting from scratch.
We have seen, there are many student unions, perhaps sometimes even within a single country. For example, Canada, who compete for influence, compete for power, and that station happens around the world, on continents and within the countries. Sometimes within a certain region of the country, there's more than one student union. What is the danger, in competing? Of course, we have the idea that in capitalist system, the competition is better, more ideas, more progress. But in case of student governments, student unions, cooperation versus competition, what would suit, what would give students more benefits?
Yeah, so with student governments, there are cases, I guess, where they do compete, or some, as we mentioned, resort to isolationism. They don't want to cooperate with the other ones, and that leads to the opposite of what we've kind of been talking about. So not sharing knowledge, not sharing resources, they're up against insurmountable adversaries that have considerably more resources, and also just knowledge, right, of how politics works, how laws work, and that are just, they're completely outgunned, essentially. So if the 1 billion students, around the world don't at least make an effort to come together and unite, then we'll just continue to be divided, and then policies will continue to be made that where students just aren't at the table, right? Because there just isn't that united movement to sustain that and make sure that things are in place, because we're up against obstacles as well, like, you know, ageism, the idea that students just aren't competent enough to make decisions. Then that even can be applies in some cases to graduate students, you know, PhD students. If you know, a president of the United States enrolled in in an undergraduate degree at an institution, they would still face similar barriers, and in some cases students are seen as second-class citizens. And was a body of literature that kind of explores that, how just the connotation of being a student implies just some kind of lesser quality of citizenship or something. But these are things that need to be countered. And you can see also in pop culture, there's a lot of connotations about student life, student government, and how it's mainly like a very social activity, right? Like fraternities and sororities and stuff, or just where there's not a lot of organized advocacy, right? As opposed to sporadic protest. And the thing too is if student governments, without student governments, right? Like in the US case, there's largely one of the only options left is just grassroots protesting, which can be effective in the short term, but to sustain protests for years, decades, it would be much more beneficial to have an organized structure that where students are all contributing to this in the long term through student fees, and can facilitate movements where people can heal, right? They don't kind of burn out. They can kind of keep going, keep passing on the knowledge until change happens, right? And we do see there's historical examples like where academics argue, like in Czechoslovakia, Brazil, Mexico, where student activism over decades eventually is a contributing factor that they argue to eventual regime change. So but you know, student governments supporting student movements, I think, would be the ideal situation.
Now we're seeing, I've been reading messages in the chat. There's a discussion happening parallel to our discussion. And there are people saying they've talked to voters, and many people don't understand how elections work, how government works. And while we have this section, and I got a question in the Q&A section. Have you considered undertaking any initiatives to help improve the general population's understanding of civics and government? Here at IAPSS, of course, our name includes, organization includes word students, but we're open, we're inclusive to everyone who wants to study political science. Now, Dr. Froese, you know, if we step outside of realm of student life and students, what are potential initiatives could be taken by civil society or maybe by the government itself to explain, not necessarily with depth of political science, but at least the basics of civics and government to regular citizens? Dr. Froese, you're muted.
Sorry, muted again. Okay. One of the things I wanted to say, just commenting on something that Justin had talked about, and that was, kind of blows my mind that university student associations in the US wouldn't have transit passes and healthcare plans for students. I don't know if that's the norm or not. I've never actually considered whether undergrad student associations had healthcare packages in the US, but if they don't, that's surprising to me and shocking. And I would think there's a huge place for student government to advocate and put those kind of packages into place. For example, here at Berman, our students were very small university, 500 students, and our students did not have a medical plan with their fee package. And I think one of our previous class presidents, who was an international studies major, negotiated the insurance package for students. And that was just really important. It's not even a fantastic package, but it's a good place to start. And I would think that as political science students, if you want to get involved in making a change, one thing is to make life better for students, absolutely. The other thing is to maybe consider developing kind of basic political and civics literacy programs to give in your local communities. To teach people, because a lot of people, here's a really interesting fact that just came out this weekend in the Canadian newspaper, the Globe and Mail, that 49% of Canadians lack some very basic literacy skills. And that is a shocking number. Half the population, can't read good. So that's something, right? That also suggests to you that probably a lot more of the population doesn't have very good political literacy skills, doesn't have very good civics literacy. And that's something I think that would be a massive opportunity for political science students. Host seminars. This is how the Constitution actually works. This is what voting does. This is why your vote counts. This is ways your vote sometimes doesn't count. This is what it means to be political. A lot of times people have an idea that being political is almost kind of like a negative thing. Oh, he's so political, But what about being political? It meant acting, being in the polis, being a citizen, being a responsible person. You need to study a little bit to get a gun license. Maybe you need to study a little bit to also be able to exercise your fullest democratic rights. And I could see political science students having a role to play organizing networks of educational projects that could expand civic literacy.
Yeah, and just as I know you mentioned the US student governments and that some don't have health plans. Yeah, we've taken a look at quite a few, and our understanding from IAPSS is that to compare, I guess, with Canada, right? So many, it's a bit uneven. There's some that are on the same tier as Canadian student unions, which for the US viewers watching, the average Canadian student union has millions of dollars in revenue every year, and it's they run large scale kind of health insurance plans and stuff, whereas some of a significant number of the US ones are generally relegated to just social activities. So essentially where the Canadian ones were in the 1950s or before. So there's over a half a century of kind of, in terms of developing the institutions that needs to be there to catch up with Canada and similar countries.
By the way, you can feel free to use the Q&A feature here on Zoom for everyone who's watching. We've been receiving some questions. There is a question for Justin. Do you think that the bad rap politics has today is making student government support less nowadays?
Yeah, as Professor Froese was saying, it's there is kind of that connotation sometimes with just being political in general, and that connotation sometimes gets translated to student government as well. And I mentioned kind of pop culture and stuff. Well, there's various movies and stuff that emulate the student government as not being an effective mechanism for policy change, right? It's as we mentioned, the issue where the US ones being where the Canadian ones were in the 1950s or before. The media sort of emulates that stereotype as well, right? Where in reality, the Canadian student unions and ones in Europe and stuff have paid staff that work with them. I know on some campuses they have hundreds of paid staff, right, who assist and implement the will of the students. And to put this into perspective even further, perhaps the largest democratic student government in the world, the European Students' Union, just has essentially 30 million students. Not only is there all the national ones have student governments, but they've united to form a continental one, whereas that's not the case in North America, right? So, however, Africa and Latin America also have continental student governments. So they've reached the point where a lot of the countries there in those continents have student governments, and then they unite further to form continental ones, and they have considerable impact on policies that span borders, right? And it just we're talking about tens of millions of students here being represented, right? And whereas here it's and I think it's also in the US case, as I mentioned, there's kind of students resorting to student movements as opposed to student government, because the student governments aren't seen as effective mechanisms of for policy change. Like for instance, even in the 1960s, Students for a Democratic Society, if you read the Port Huron statement, their kind of guiding document, it states that essentially the student governments weren't very effective. So they're kind of resorting to this other organization, almost an anti-student government to try to get their point across, right? Because they thought the governments were in league with the university administrations and stuff. They didn't have independence. They weren't their own nonprofit corporations separate from the university, so the university couldn't really meddle into their affairs as much, which, yeah, in some cases, U.S. student governments don't really have that corporate autonomy. But so yeah, and so perhaps a lot of the effort is on these student movements, whereas given that the issues are so the crises are so immediate, as opposed to investing in the long-term student government stuff that could foster a sustained social movement over longer periods of time.
Speaking of, well, it is just in general, speaking of campuses, we have a question. What about utilizing voter registration drives on campuses as a way to get students involved in political science education? This question is not directed to neither of you, so feel free to answer.
Yeah. I mean, anything where you can help people to increase their knowledge of politics and their civic engagement, I think is a fantastic way to go. Absolutely. I mean, it strikes me, even just listening to Justin a couple minutes ago, there's really a lot of work to be done, in particular in the United States, with students kind of standing up and saying, this is the kind of country that we want. This is the kind of society that we want. We want a society of greater literacy, of more education for politics and for civics. We want a society in which people know more about their country and engage in it in a meaningful way. And I think we have spent 40 years engaging in a kind of consumeristic way with our societies, not just in the United States. I don't want to pick on the Americans, but in Canada too. We engage in a very consumeristic way. We engage on Twitter and Facebook. Is there a way to move beyond that to engage in the real world? And I think there'll be a tremendous desire for that when the pandemic is over too. People wanting to get together face to face. Everyone will be tired of Zoom, tired of Twitter, right? Get together face to face and build something, make your society better, and take it back from the people who want to just break stuff and make something that everybody can be proud of, right? And I think that's one of the hardest things with democracy, is everybody getting involved to build something. It's easy to get involved, to criticize. It's easy to just tear something down. Heck, it's even easy to protest. But the point is staying behind afterwards, picking up the pieces and building something. And that's really hard.
Yeah, I've heard this proverb, I think, in a few languages, that breaking is not building. And democracy is, I think, in acceptance speech, Kamala Harris, the elected vice president of the United States, she said that democracy is not a destination, it's a process, just paraphrasing, of course. But yeah, it can be quite fragile. We answered the questions in the Q&A. Perhaps closing statements from both of you regarding everything we've talked today, and maybe with the hope for the future for those who are watching, and with the hope for our students. What can we do today to start building something better in the world, post-pandemic world?
You want to go first, Justin?
Sure. And I would just like to say, first of all, if there are any student representatives of US student governments who may be watching this, please get in touch with IAPSS. We can offer you infrastructure support. We'll help you if you need help with sharing information, best practices. If you want to build your organizational capabilities, we're here to help. We view it as a charitable endeavor at this point, and we just want to make sure that your students have a voice at the international community. There are a number of opportunities for US students to get involved in bodies like, for instance, for applying to consultative status with UNESCO, which could have opportunities for providing input to politics, to policies on an international level in terms of UN resolutions in collaboration with education NGOs. So you'd be right there with the other education stakeholders, and we need more student organizations in bodies like that. And in addition, just to build off of the previous point, it's very important, in addition to, protesting is obviously necessary in some cases. And we also need students to work together to help craft policies and put forward reforms, right? So we can help kind of guide our movements on the ground. And I think that's an area that is particularly in need for student government currently. And that might be a way to help lead a path perhaps toward repealing the laws that limit the collection of student fees by student governments in the United States, which has contributed to the fall of the United States Student Association and various student governments at the state level. So I would definitely recommend looking at those possibilities and getting in touch with students from other countries, even other campuses, right? It's isolationism. Don't let that be what stifles your student movement. Reach out to other cities. Try to establish joint initiatives. Write the policy proposals, and even other countries. Right, student unions in other countries, student governments have lots of best practices. Maybe in some cases they helped lead campaigns that in their countries affected similar policies, and they actually were able to win, or in a coalition with other advocacy groups. So they might have various insights, or they may be able to donate resources and provide other support to make sure that forces of populism, fascism are successfully combated, right? And we can build a society that's and build better education systems that are more conducive to the student experience.
So in the Q&A, Heather Bain asked if maybe a push in certain parts of the US to lower the voting age to 16, she wonders if that would be successful to create more incentive for schools to teach civic education. And I think, yeah. I mean, there might be something to the fact that a lot of times people are allowed to vote when they're 18. It's not a reality for you in high school, but you're allowed to do it as a real adult when you're 18, right at the moment when you're not focused on that stuff. You're focused on going to college or getting your first job, and you're not at all focused on civics. Whereas in high school, you were taking classes in social studies or civics education already. Possibly you were a little bit interested, or at least you had some kind of awareness. So yeah, if you can vote when you're 16, you can have sex when you're 16. I mean, if you can drive a car, you can have sex. Why can't you vote, right? It seems like it would be pretty reasonable, and I think that it could be a way to engage students in the political life of their country. Absolutely. I think the thing I didn't know when I was young is that people who get involved when they're young stay involved. They care. They stay in touch with the way things are working, and they try to make the world a better place. And I think I was already, I was cynical 18-year-old thinking, I don't want to do that stuff. It's not going to get me anywhere, right? And I don't think that was the appropriate way to think about it at all. I think what you guys are doing is the right way to go. Organize, get involved, think about what you can do using your major to make the world the kind of world you want to live in. And I think that is inspiring to me.
Thank you, Dr. Pro, for the kind words of inspiration. This is the end of our panel. I would like to thank you, both panelists, for agreeing to join us and discussing these questions from their experience. There's so much work to be done ahead in terms of global student government and increasing the popularity of political science education, increasing awareness about how government works and how civil society works. However, we thank you for joining. Again, this event was organized by the, we've said it many times, IAPSS, International Association for Political Science Students. all participants who have signed up through Mobilize will receive a link to donate. IAPSS is funded entirely by students, but also with the help of people like you. And all the money go towards the development of organization, including for scholarships and opportunities for students from around the world. So you will receive the link in your email. Also, all participants will receive a promo code to join IAPSS. I believe it will be a 50% discount. The membership fee is already quite affordable. However, it will be even more affordable with this promo code. As Justin said, isolationism is not the way. Right now is the time to get involved, and we want you, as that famous US poster with Uncle Sam looking at you. We want you in IAPSS, and we hope you will answer the call. Rory, do you have something to say then?
No, thank you so much for everybody for attending today. It's been such an incredibly engaging event with all of you here. We've loved the caliber of discussion in the chat. I would just like to, again, make a push for all of you to join IAPSS, because as we mentioned at the beginning of the call, IAPSS is a global student government where we have 6 regional divisions. So IAPSS is actually on every inhabited continent in the world, which makes us truly global. We have a list of incredible partners that we worked with and that we continue to work with to continue to provide opportunities for students to get involved on the global levels. Some of our partners actually include Voters Without Borders. We have Women in Foreign Policy. We partnered with UN 75 for the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. As Justin mentioned, we are affiliated with UNESCO, and we are also affiliated with Civics too, which is also focused on civic engagement. So we do welcome those opportunities. In addition, we also have student research committees that allow people to pursue their particular interests as well within IAPSS. So for example, we have one on accessibility, we have one on space politics. So IAPSS really does try and appeal to different niche interests and focus on multidisciplinary education to empower people to take action. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this and you guys continue to engage with us. This is not a single event, but this is a conversation, and we hope to be able to engage with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Justin, you're the host and you can finish the meeting.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone.